The heavens are full of them. The night the screens went blind, the air inside the bunker was cool, controlled, and thick with the scent of ozone from the humming electronics. It was a subterranean world of methodical precision far removed from the cold, dark reality of the skies above the Reich. Here, in the heart of a Himmelbett sector, the war was not a chaotic frenzy of steel and fire, but an orderly procession of light. Green phosphorescent blips, each representing a British bomber, crawled across the circular glass of the main plotting table. Each blip was a problem to be solved, a target to be assigned. For the young men of the Luftnachrichtenschub, the Luftwaffe's signals corps, this was a sacred ritual. Their eyes, accustomed to the gloom, traced the paths of the enemy with practiced ease. On the Seeberg plotting table, friendly fighter positions were projected from below, appearing as small pools of red light. The entire aerial ballet was overseen by the operations officer, his voice a calm, steady presence in the headset of every fighter pilot circling in the darkness miles above. The system was a marvel of German engineering. A chain of Freya early warning radar stations on the coast would detect the incoming bomber stream. Then, as the bombers flew inland, each was handed off to a specific sector, a bed in the sky. Within that sector, two highly accurate Würzburg radars would lock on, one tracking the bomber, the other tracking the assigned German night fighter. From the bunker, the controller would simply talk his pilot onto the target, feeding him corrections until the bomber appeared in the fighter's own airborne radar, or as a dark silhouette against the stars. It was a precise, lethal, and almost foolproof system. The architect of this formidable defense, General Joseph Kammhuber, had woven an electronic net over the approaches to Germany, and night after night it ensnared its prey. The British called it the Kammhuber Line. To the men who operated it, it was simply the wall. On this particular night, the 24th of July 1943, the wall was holding. A significant enemy force was detected heading towards Hamburg. The alerts went out, the night fighters were scrambled. In the operations command bunker, the operators settled in for their deadly work. The first hostile blips appeared on their screens right on schedule, moving with the predictable speed of a Lancaster or a Halifax. The plots were made, the vectors calculated. Everything was normal. Then something strange happened, first on one screen then another. The single clean blip representing an enemy bomber seemed to blossom. It elongated, smeared, and then split into multiple returns. The operator, a young Hauptgraf fighter, trained for months to interpret these electronic shadows, frowned and adjusted the gain on his cathode ray tube. He checked his equipment, no fault. He called over his superior. On the screen, where there should have been one aircraft, there were now 5, then 10, all clustered together, moving at the same speed and altitude. It was impossible. No bomber formation flew that tightly. Within minutes, the anomaly was no longer an anomaly. It was the new reality. Across the entire front of the approaching raid, every radar screen and every bunker began to decay into chaos. What had been a comprehensible, orderly stream of individual targets dissolved into a vast, impenetrable cloud of electronic noise.
The screens, once clear windows into the night sky, were now flooded with a blizzard of phantom signals. Hundreds of blips became thousands, then tens of thousands. They filled the air, a vast, ghostly armada advancing silently upon the Reich. The controllers stared in disbelief. Their precise, elegant system was blinded, utterly and completely. The plotters could no longer distinguish a real bomber from the ghosts that surrounded it. The red lights of the German fighters moved aimlessly, searching for targets in an ocean of false echoes. A frantic voice came over the command circuit from a pilot, his words crackling with confusion and rising panic. "The heavens are full of them. I am in the middle of the bomber stream. I can see nothing. There are echoes everywhere, everywhere." But he was not in the middle of the bomber stream. He was flying through a storm of ghosts, a storm made not of water or ice, but of simple, unassuming strips of aluminum foil. In a single hour, the most sophisticated air defense system in the world had been rendered deaf, dumb, and blind. The wall had crumbled into dust. To understand the magnitude of what transpired on that July night, we must first understand the brutal arithmetic of the air war in early 1943. For RAF Bomber Command, it was a period of existential crisis. Night after night, hundreds of young men flew into the heart of Germany, and night after night, a horrifying percentage of them did not return. The operational loss rate hovered around 5%, a seemingly small number that masked the grim reality. For an air crewman, a tour of duty was 30 operations. Simple probability dictated that his chances of survival were terrifyingly slim. The crews knew this. They saw the empty beds and the vacant chairs at breakfast. This grim attrition was the direct result of the Kammhuber Line's efficiency. German night fighters, expertly guided by ground control, were exacting a terrible toll. The pressure on the commander of Bomber Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, was immense. His strategic bombing campaign, designed to cripple German industry and morale, was itself being bled white. The very viability of the offensive was in question. Something had to be done. The solution would not come from a new type of bomber or a more powerful bomb, but from the quiet, esoteric world of radiophysics. It came from a division of British scientific intelligence headed by a brilliant young physicist named R.V. Jones. Jones was a central figure in what the press would later call the Wizard War, the unseen battle of beams, pulses, and countermeasures that was every bit as critical as the fighting on the ground. The concept was astoundingly simple. It had been discovered independently by researchers in Britain, Germany, and even Japan before the war. If you drop a bundle of metallic strips cut to half the wavelength of the radar signal you wish to jam, those strips will resonate and reflect the radar energy, creating an echo on the screen indistinguishable that of a large aircraft. The British code name for this simple yet revolutionary device was window. The Germans, who had also discovered the principle, called it duple. The idea was so simple, in fact, that its potential use created a profound strategic dilemma. For years, Churchill's scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, had blocked the deployment of window. His reasoning, laid out in a now famous memorandum, was chillingly logical.
He argued that if the British used window to blind German radar, the Germans would immediately understand how it worked, copy it, and use it against Britain's own air defense system. Britain, being more densely populated and with its crucial cities more concentrated, was far more vulnerable to a bombing offensive than the sprawling industrial landscape of Germany. Cherwell warned that if the secret got out, the paper may be on the other foot, and the RAF would be powerless to stop the Luftwaffe from raining fire on London. The fear of retaliation was so great that the most effective countermeasure of the entire air war sat on a shelf, forbidden from use. But by mid-1943, two factors had changed the calculation. First, the relentless losses over Germany could no longer be sustained. Bomber Command was approaching a breaking point. The risk of inaction had begun to outweigh the risk of German retaliation. Second, and more decisively, was the introduction of a new piece of British technology, the H-2S airborne mapping radar. This device gave bomber navigators a crude but effective radar image of the ground below, allowing for far more accurate bombing through clouds or darkness. However, it also represented a huge liability. If a bomber equipped with H-2S were to be shot down over enemy territory, German scientists would inevitably recover the wreckage and reverse engineer the magnetron at its heart. Declassified minutes from the Air Ministry reveal a growing consensus. It was only a matter of time before the Germans captured an intact H-2S set. Once they did, they would realize that the British possessed advanced microwave radar technology, and the secret of window would be compromised anyway. The Germans would deduce its potential use against their own lower-frequency radars. The window of opportunity to use window with the element of total surprise was closing fast. The decision was made at the highest levels. Operation Gomorrah, a series of massive raids aimed at the complete destruction of the city of Hamburg, would be the moment to unleash the storm. For the thousands of aircrewmen preparing for the raid, the pre-flight briefing was unlike any they had ever attended. After the usual details of the route, the target, and the weather, intelligence officers unveiled the new device. Veteran testimony recalls the scene. Men were shown brown paper-wrapped bundles of what looked like simple silver Christmas tinsel. They were strips of black paper coated in aluminum foil, precisely cut to 26 centimeters, the optimal length to jam the German Würzburg radar. The crews were instructed that upon reaching a certain point on the map, one crew member per aircraft would be responsible for pushing one bundle of these strips out of the flare chute every minute. The initial reaction was one of skepticism. It seemed almost ludicrous that these flimsy packets of paper could defeat the feared German defenses. But as the intelligence officers explained the science, skepticism slowly turned to a fragile, desperate hope. For men who had watched their friends vanish into the night, any chance, no matter how strange, was worth taking. On the evening of July 24th, 791 bombers lumbered into the sky from airfields across eastern England. As they assembled over the North Sea, they formed a highly compressed stream, a tactic designed to saturate a single German fighter control sector. This concentration was, in itself, a gamble.
It made the stream a denser, more attractive target. But tonight it was part of a larger deception. The density of the real aircraft would be the seed from which a forest of phantom aircraft would grow. As the leading aircraft crossed the enemy coast, the quiet order was given over the intercoms. Window. 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 Inside the cold, vibrating fuselages, airmen began their strange new task. They broke open the bundles and began pushing the metallic strips out into the slipstream. The moment they left the aircraft, the thousands of strips blossomed into a dense, reflective cloud. With each passing bomber adding to the trail, and each aircraft dropping a new cloud every minute, the effect was cumulative and catastrophic. They were not merely jamming the radar, they were hijacking it. They were creating a false reality, a counterfeit airspace filled with an army of ghosts. Back in the German command bunkers, the situation had spiraled from confusion to total system collapse. The meticulous order of the Himmelbett system depended entirely on the ability to isolate and track a single target. Now there were no single targets. There were only vast, amorphous clouds of echoes that stretched for miles. A controller attempting to guide his pilot would see his target, the enemy bomber, merge into a sea of identical signals. The Wurzburg radar, the precision instrument of the entire system, was designed to lock onto the strongest return signal. A dense cloud of window presented a far larger and more reflective target than a single aircraft, effectively seducing the radar beam away from the real bomber. The German controllers were helpless. They could see the general direction of the raid, a massive smudge on their screens moving inexorably towards Hamburg, but they were powerless to direct their fighters to individual targets within it. The carefully orchestrated ballet of death had devolved into a blind melee. First-hand accounts from German night fighter pilots paint a picture of utter chaos. They were vectored into empty patches of sky, only to be told the bomber stream was miles away. Some, using their own airborne Liechtenstein radar, found themselves chasing dense clouds of window, their scopes showing a perfect target that would never materialize into the dark shape of a bomber. A few pilots, abandoning the useless instructions from the ground, flew into the main bomber stream hoping to find targets by sight. This was the Wilde Sau, or wild boar tactic, a desperate improvisation. But without guidance, they were like men hunting in a dark forest with no moon. They found few targets. The bomber crews for the first time felt an almost eerie sense of safety. The predicted flak was sporadic and inaccurate. The dreaded night fighters were nowhere to be seen. The path to Hamburg was clear. The consequences for the city were apocalyptic. The lack of effective opposition allowed the bomber stream to proceed with a terrifying deliberateness. They could fly lower, slower, and take more time to identify their aiming points. The first night of Operation Gomorrah was a devastating success for Bomber Command. But it was the loss statistics that told the true story of Window's impact. Of 791 aircraft that set out, only 12 were lost, a loss rate of just 1.5%. Weeks earlier, a raid of this scale against a target so deep in Germany would have likely resulted in the loss of 40 or 50 aircraft.
The lives of hundreds of Allied airmen had been saved by cheap, mass-produced strips of paper. For the German High Command, the morning of July 25th brought a wave of shock and disbelief. General Kammhuber's prized defense network had been neutralized overnight. In a state of near panic, Luftwaffe signals experts were scrambled to investigate the cause. It did not take them long. They quickly found the strange aluminum strips scattered across the countryside in the path of the raid. The realization was immediate and horrifying. This was their own invention, Dupel, a device they had developed in 1942 but had been forbidden to use by a paranoid Hermann Göring who feared the British would copy it. Now, their own foresight had been turned against them with devastating effect. The psychological impact on the German leadership was profound. A sense of technological superiority had been shattered. They had been outmaneuvered not by a superior weapon, but by a superior strategy, a willingness to deploy a technology they themselves possessed but had locked away. The Battle of Hamburg raged for another week, with Window being used on subsequent raids to paralyze the German defenses. The resulting firestorm, fanned by unusually hot and dry weather, consumed the city, killing over 40,000 civilians and leaving 1 million homeless. It was a brutal, terrifying demonstration of what air power could achieve when the technological balance was tipped so decisively. The immediate German response was a frantic scramble to find a counter to Window. They had been caught completely unprepared. Their first attempts were tactical improvisations. They largely abandoned the rigid Himmelbett ground control system and shifted more responsibility to the pilots themselves, creating new freelance hunting tactics like the aforementioned Wilde Sau. Fighter pilots were now directed to the general area of the bomber stream and told to find their own targets visually, aided by searchlights in the glow of burning cities. This had some success, but it was a far cry from the lethal efficiency of the old system. On the technological front, German scientists worked feverishly. They experimented with new radar frequencies outside the range that Window was cut for. They developed systems like Wurzlaus, a modification to the Würzburg that could detect the slight Doppler shift in frequency caused by a moving aircraft's propellers, allowing an experienced operator to distinguish it from the more static flutter of Window. Another system, Nuremberg, sought to track the faint radio transmissions from the British bomber's own H-2S sets. But these were all stopgap measures. For several crucial months in the autumn and winter of 1943, Bomber Command enjoyed a period of unprecedented superiority in the electronic war. Loss rates remained low, and the bombers were able to strike targets deep inside Germany, including Berlin itself, with a level of impunity they had not known before. The story of Window is more than just the story of a single battle or a clever invention. It represents a fundamental turning point in the history of warfare. It was the moment that electronic countermeasures came of age, proving that the invisible spectrum of radio waves was a battle space as critical as land, sea, or air. The success of Window validated the work of scientists like R.V. Jones and demonstrated to military commanders that wars could be won and lost in the laboratory as well as on the battlefield. The principles pioneered that night over Hamburg, deception, jamming, and electronic misdirection, became foundational pillars of modern military doctrine. Every stealth aircraft, every anti-radar missile, every electronic warfare suite on a modern warship owes a part of its conceptual lineage to those simple strips of aluminum foil dropped from the bomb bays of Lancasters. Archival footage and declassified reports from the era reveal the dual nature of this technological leap. For the Allies, it was a war-winning innovation that saved countless lives and enabled the strategic bombing campaign to continue at a critical juncture. It was a triumph of intellect over brute force. For the Germans, it was a technological Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack that exposed a fatal vulnerability in their defenses and induced a crisis of confidence that rippled all the way to the top of the Nazi regime. It forced a complete reevaluation of their air defense strategy and set off a desperate technological arms race that they would ultimately lose. The storm of aluminum that filled the German radar screens in July 1943 was a physical manifestation of a strategic truth that in modern conflict, the ability to control information, to see the enemy while remaining unseen, is the ultimate weapon. That night, the men in the British bombers, armed with nothing more than packets of paper, became invisible, and in doing so, they changed the course of the air war, plunging the defenders of the Reich into a darkness of their own making, a world of phantom fleets and silent exploding screens. The ghosts they created were, for a time, more powerful than the machines sent to hunt them. Thanks for watching. We are curious to hear about your anecdotes or thoughts on this story. Please comment them down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to World War Echoes so that you never miss out on our daily stories about World War II. Take care.